Once upon a time, we had romances in video games, and they were dreadful, and we liked them that way. But before we had the first introduction of video games and romance in the form of Mass Effect 2, there were earlier, stranger, proto-texts, particularly this strange game built around reading and Dungeons and Dragons called Baldur's Gate 2. This game had everything, and by that I mean it had an engine that could do a lot of text prompts, and therefore it wound up featuring almost everything you can imagine a non-typing text parser doing, attempted in its big wonky interface of the Infinity engine. And that included Smoochin. But you know what? Nobody in the whole internet ever has ever written down whether or not these romances were good. What's more, when I wrote about Baldur's Gate 2, many moons ago, I mentioned offhandedly some details about the romances, but never really touched on what they were like in the game itself as content. That's a real oversight on my part. When a game like this, a classic, has something like that in it, surely it's prime to look at in Smooch Month. So let's, shall we? First up, content warning for sexual assault, abandonment, and misogyny. What, that content warning? See, Baldur's Gate 2 came out in 2000, and it got an enhanced edition in 2013. It would be ridiculous of me to pretend that the first version, that I spent years and years playing and replaying, did not deserve some kind of deliberate primacy in my mind, and with that comes the potential risk of being seen as the way things were done. There's definitely a priority in my mind for the way the game was, and I know that prioritization means there's a risk, viewing all the romances in the game now, that I treat the newer characters as less interesting inherently because I haven't got embarrassing Usenet posts fanficking them with my protagonist. I can wirelessly download and play Baldur's Gate 2 on a tablet in my backyard was the dividing line between the past and the future that made Penny Arcade's Tycho realize he was never getting a hoverboard, and that comic is 9 years old now, and it's from people who could definitely be considered an example of public boomification receiving. There is content both old and new for discussion, both the Enhanced Edition's new romances and the originals written for the fear that Lorraine Williams would appear out of nowhere and smack you for trying to steal Buck Rogers' money out of her mouth by explaining what THACO was to a pre-PHP web forum. As it was, the content has not been contended, and so I must be content to continue this content within that content as content despite ensuing contentious discontent for tender contention. And now, ranking them in reverse order of best to Anomen, here are the romance options that you have available to you if you were a serious D&D role player looking for a game with meaningful romances and wasn't planning on modding in Solorphane or Kelsey.
There's no roof to this world. I feel as if I shall fall into this sky of yours sometimes.
Best Girl, Viconia. We start out strong with the voice of Grey Delisle behind a cruel, vindictive, petty, and demeaning drow woman who will spend the entire game dunking on you until and even after you're dead, and she is the best. Viconia is a very simple kind of romance, simple enough for my tiny teenage monkey brain to manage, where she will call you an idiot for putting up with her. Then if you put up with her, she comes back and calls you an idiot again. Fundamentally, the structure of these romances were as rudimentary text puzzles. You'd get some dialogue from the game, which could be attributed to an NPC, and then you'd be given one or more responses you could make. These dialogue options could set flags or lead to other dialogue options. You know, classic dating sim stuff, like we'd see in Breakfast Cult, the visual novel, or Runaway City, don't Google that one. This meant you could do anything you could do with a text prompt. This unfortunately meant for the most part these conversations took the form of the partner bringing to you an extensive sequence of text, often voiced, and your response had to be a simple one-liner shot back, often structured to communicate very clearly the type of response you were giving. You know, your simp, sneer, snore kind of communication. The direct result of this was that the character who had a story to tell you, who wanted to take charge of the conversation, was going to have the most to say, the most to do in these exchanges. Now, Viconia's story is a super downer, but undeniably she has a perspective. She usually thinks you're an idiot, and she doesn't know why you trust her, and she thinks you suck. She'll tell you stories that include her personal trauma as a marginalized woman in a culture that does not extend to her the protection of the societal rules, and she'll want to watch your reactions to that. Mostly, she stares you down and waits for you to recoil from her. When you don't, that surprises her. You even get the option of steering her morality. It's not a mind control thing, you have to genuinely convince her over time to reconsider whether her neutral evil perspective is the right way, and she'll shift to a non-lawful, non-evil position. Basically, she stays not believing in a society, but she'll start to consider other people as having value inherently. And that's pretty cool. So yeah, 9 out of 10, minor notes. Maybe do it without including sexual assault in the backstory, folks.
If we are going to work together, there's something you need to know about me. There is nothing I won't do to stay alive. Nothing. Do you understand?
The best girl's best girl, Hexat. The enhanced edition of the game introduces 4 new romances, and most of them get to live up here in the rarefied air of almost as good as Viconia. And you may be thinking, hey, Talon, you might be biased towards characters you've been playing with for 20 years as opposed to the ones you've only been playing with for a few. And to that I would say, yes. But also, Grey Delisle's voice is amazing, making Viconia ridiculously attractive as well as having an actually compelling story and personality. And Hexat agrees. Hexat is a vampire character introduced in the Enhanced Edition, and she's interesting to me because she's an example of an evil character who isn't just gibberingly vile and hostile, Corgan, and is capable of recognizing reasons for social graces, Edwin, which means that her overall affect is more cold and withdrawn with most characters. Of course, there are plenty of NPCs that don't like her, such as goody two-shoes anti-undead characters like Arie, Dorn, Anomen, and Mazzy. Jan Jansen also doesn't like her. And you might think, hey, what's the big deal here? She eats people. I know it's easy to get past that as a player character in a big sense, but it is pretty notable that these characters hold on to the moral implications of the fact that she eats people. But, if you can look past that, and yeah, that's a big if, but obviously if you can get past that, Hexat is a very pragmatic, hurt person who is trying as much as she can to live. This is obviously something that runs headlong into the problem of how she's already dead. The romance you get with her starts out flirty and toying, and has its own sensitivities. Like, don't joke around with her about her being a vampire while she's trying to get into your underwear, which I will note, she is trying to do. It's playful, it's teasing, it's got some give and take, rather than the necessarily one-sided power dynamic you see in a lot of these kind of game characters. What I like about it a lot is that Hexat and Viconia flirt, and yes, even bang, and then break up as well, so you get to see that Hexat's behavior is not just her trying to find the best way to talk to you, but it's how she reacts with intimate partners, period. She is only interested in women partners, and you'd think that people could be normal about that, but it seems that at the time of her release there were some people with real takes going on at that point, including this amazing phrase.
In my Faerun there is no lesbian people. No offense to the lesbian people, but this is just how I roleplay.
Hey! Do I get to join you or what? You could use my level-headed advice, tactical wisdom, and moral clarity.
Welcome to Tumblr. Nera. Nera is a wild mage, someone introduced to the Baldur's Gate universe after a mere 10 years of getting better at making this kind of game and writing this kind of character, and I see criticism of her that tends towards the modernity of her. That notion is, you can see that this awkward girl who makes double entendres, unintentionally, has anxiety about her powers that can randomly teleport her places, and has powerful moral stances like torture is bad, is too much like a modern girl, which is to say, I guess, sometime shortly after World War II? Nera's charming. She puts a W in how she pronounces bunch. She's a bit scattered, her attention jumps around, and she's not completely direct, but I have a really hard time hating her. This is a romance that's also full of little moments. I guess its biggest problem to me, and the reason it doesn't stand out as high as Viconia, is that because Nera's lack of confidence comes through in how she reacts to people. On the other hand, it has touches of the things that exist in the world, things that ground you more in the reality of the world than a lot of the other romantic dialogues that try to keep you disconnected from your environment, because they don't know when or how they're going to wind up coming up on a randomizer. It's also going to be coloured by the fact that when I double-checked scripts and reactions to her, there's a whole category of players out there who just hate her for being too Tumblr. And those people can eat shit.
Speak your mind.
Have a nice summer. Jahira. As far as the base game romances go, watch out for that first step down, because it's a doozy. Jahira was a beloved, I guess, character from Baldur's Gate, where she was part of a package deal with her husband, Khalid. They were put in Baldur's Gate 2, along with a host of other characters and references, which is a great way to create that sensation of continuity between the two games. This is why we have characters like Minsk and Edwin, fairly low on the best girl list, by the way, and Viconia. Oh, hi, Viconia. And I'm not saying I understand the mindset behind these choices, like causal reasons, but it seems they wanted to bring in Jahira, didn't want to bring in Khalid, and made Jahira a romance option. So they, killed Khalid? And made seeing his corpse part of the starting dungeon. I guess it's a good pop, a great way to make that opening dungeon and new villain feel important. It's not a bad idea per se. It's certainly a rough one for me, someone who hadn't played Baldur's Gate 1, to suddenly be told that this old friend was now traumatized and grieving the loss of her husband, also an old friend. Like, I didn't know this character, and now I had to try and help her navigate one of the hardest things ever. Don't worry though, you kinda can't screw it up, and it also doesn't matter much. Now, here's the problem with Jahira as a romance. Once you get past the death of her husband, she's a character who already had her entire story arc back in the first game, meaning that as a romance option, she just doesn't have much to do. She's not a character the narrative can handle well anyway, because, it's hard to say this kind of thing without saying I'm telling the video game lady to smile more, but Jahira's character is a simplified archetype that starts with a whiteboard diagram of, your mum? She's generically stern and dour, mostly speaking up to point out whatever it is you're about to do to advance your plans is a bad idea. What's more, because she's a neutral-aligned character in true 2E fashion, this means she'll whine about anything you do that's too evil, but also whine about you doing too much good. It's not a good look. Jahira has a unique spell, Harper's Call, that is to say she's a fighter druid who can cast Raise Dead. This is the extent of how she is mechanically remarkable, as a character who can do a little bit of interesting stuff, but whose primary job is hit things with the worst category of weapons. It means that doing the Jahira relationship quest feels a lot more like doing your chores while you're being nagged about it.
Sometimes one must put aside one's heart to achieve a greater good.
Better than Anomen, Rasad. Another enhanced edition character, Rasad is a Sun Soul monk, which, if you know your 2nd edition game balance, might leave you cringing a little. As a character, Rasad is pretty morose, serious dude, a kind of mix of stoic and sad boy that works out pretty well for a particular type of aesthetic preference. He's bald, tattooed, ripped to hell, and mad about his family situation, and I think you can recognize that even if you're not into that, you can recognize that it's a thing that, oh boy, some people can be into. If you need an idea of the kind of guy Rasad is, he's capable of being nice to Edwin, which flummoxes Edwin so much that it shuts down the conversation. Not only that, Rasad's story adds in another point that Anomen sucks. As a romance, Rasad is kind of a counterpart to Hexat. While Hexat invites you to play with her, to flirt with her, Rasad just kind of stands there and lets you play with him. Flirting with Rasad looks a lot like, well, messing with him. He's very serious and easily flustered by you toying with him, which again, if this is your thing, he's a really good version of the thing. He's not higher though, because his story, in its totality, kinda sucks. As a character, I like him, but as a story to play out, he's used to tell a really mid-narrative. It's disappointing, I guess, in that the way it ends sounds like a story you should have been able to play out and have some agency in, rather than being bumped out of it at an awkward spot. I get it, when this character is essentially something added to another story, but the result is that this very important story, presented through this character, stands apart as a sort of footnote in another, greater story, and it makes you, his love interest, into another, equally minor footnote.
You rescued me. Oh, I knew you would. That's why I care about you, you know. You never let your loved ones down.
Technically a net negative. Arie. The first original to Baldur's Gate 2 character that you can do a smooch on, Arie is a cleric wizard you recruit from the circus after an evil illusionist took it over and made a dungeon out of a circus tent. When you meet her, you learn she was raised by Quail, a companion from the first game, and that she is the elf equivalent of 18 years old, naive, and also as fragile as an iPhone screen made entirely out of wafer biscuits that ignite spontaneously when it's looked at. Oh, and she's also a member of a race of winged elves, except she had her wings amputated while she lived in a cage at the circus. So, that's not a no-impact story beat. And if you might think, oh, that sounds heavy, I bet a lot of time is spent dealing with that emotional fallout, then yes. Yes, you do, and yes, that's right. And woo! That's not great fun, but don't worry, she interrupts the trauma recovery talk with the utter naivete and the neediness of reassurance. And there's nothing wrong with being traumatized and needing reassurance, but it's kind of a thing that works at odds with a character who has the magic that lets her stop time and summon demons. It's also just not a great game for expressing those ideas, especially since your character can only ever offer, again, a small number of simple responses that read a little bit like, do you mind my trauma? Check, yes, no, or maybe. Mechanically, Arie is honestly fine, even if she is, like I said, fragile. She's 2 of the slowest leveling classes and she doesn't get much support early on, plus her physical stats mean ways to protect her tend to be expensive. But you'll cross a money threshold in the game and suddenly you can spend it without noticing it. Honestly, Arie is probably a pretty decent spellcaster to add to your party if you're playing for the first time, because she can probably do anything you need if you can protect her. Mechanically, she's fine. Unless you romance her. If you follow the Arie romance route all the way through, she has a kid with you. And you might ask, how does that work? Well, you get a baby. It's an item. It sits in your inventory. You can't move it or get rid of it. Which, that's probably for the best, but also does mean that you're suddenly down an entire inventory slot? What do you get for this in exchange for this? Nothing. Technically speaking, Arie is a perfectly ordinary, extremely agreeable character who will go along with a lot of parties if your reputation doesn't absolutely tank. But if you romance her, you're committing to give up one of the party's inventory slots in exchange for nothing. Which is okay, I guess. It's not like kids are things you get because of the advantages, but it sure is a rude shock to discover it in a game that up to this point has largely treated challenges as things you overcome to get cool shit. Oh, by the way, if you do bring Arie and you don't romance her, you can see her wind up in a relationship with Hairdelise, a character I still don't feel I have a good read on. Either Hairdelise fucks, or he is in fact the most chaste fucker ever, figuring saying poetry at people is the same thing as getting to third base. Also, Arie will sign up to be Minsk's new witch, which is also very sweet, and the whole trio can make a very lovely G-rated found family group. But in the weird het world of Baldur's Gate baseline, Arie is still in 6th place for being an interesting romance.
Fair lady, what brings you to this cesspool of corruption?
Best Anomen. Anomen. This is a grim spot to be on the list. Anomen is, in the base game, the only romance available to women. He is a lawful neutral fighter cleric who is aiming to become a member of the Order of the Radiant Heart, an order of paladins and the like, serving a polytheistic group of gods including Torm, Tyr, and Helm. That is to say, 3 different gods of justice and law that are all represented by armoured white guys who knows what's best for you. Don't worry, I'm sure there's nothing wrong with this cosmology. But don't worry, because when your reputation is too low and you advise him to be obedient to his father, like, a lawful neutral character probably would be, he can't become a member of this order of class dobbers and instead cracks up under the pressure and becomes chaotic neutral. Anomen is an insufferable, self-righteous braggart who has an illegal build mechanically. That's not an important thing per se, but it kind of stands out to me that he's a character they bent the rules to make happen in the game, and this is the kind of character they made with it. This character you deal with is a grindingly cruel and petty, constantly demeaning to strangers, and treats I didn't get into a particular religious club as a world-endingly harmful to his self-esteem. Which, for a guy who's got nothing going on but ego, makes sense. It's so damaging to his sense of reality. He will attack other members of your party, including a gentle older paladin and Viconia, because both the good and evil party members attack his sense of righteousness that he has had shown to be meaningless. Basically, the Order bounces him back because he's not a good judge of character or justice, and then he proves them right. And you get to romance him through this. Anomen's story is very much about how he relates to women, and you might think that's a rich field for interesting ideas, but no, it's the kind of thing where you could swap women for stamp collection. It's 2 women, it's his sister and it's you. The wishes and opinions of the women in question are not high importance in this story. Romancing Anomen is mostly a matter of agreeing with what he wants to do and not making him feel stupid, which... that's hard, and he does have big, angry outbursts. These get worse over time as he starts to see everything lawful or structured as an example of a failure of society. Anomen becomes the Joker because he lives in a society well before we had those memes to express it. Random tidbit, Anomen won't date half-orcs or dwarves, but he will date halflings. And in the Enhanced Edition, we get to hear how he talks to a black woman. It's not good. It's not good.
I can hardly believe it. You, the spawn of Baal himself. Urgathos was wise to tie my fate to yours. Think of the rivers of blood we could spill across the realms.
Worse than an Anomen. Dorn. There is a chance you are into horny, thirsty, one-note orc daddies. If that is the case, congratulations, there's a character for you. I, however, prefer at least 2 notes to romanceable characters, and that's where Dorn winds up lacking. Dorn's only way of interacting with people is a form of bullying people for what he can perceive as weakness. This list of things he considers weakness includes a lack of physical strength, a lack of size, unwillingness to murder, a willingness to commit to an ideal, or an obedience to an authority, or having friends. Basically, everyone. This is a guy who can look at Saravok and go, you had someone you respected? What a wuss. He does have something of a point there, because Saravok's mentor had the really stupid name Winsky Parawait. Dorn is written like someone with a personality and an opinion, and he's having fun doing what he does, but he is very demanding of your party. I imagine he could look like the payoff for running an evil party because he's incompatible with a bunch of things, and I guess he's mechanically strong. I soloed this game so much that he doesn't actually look very remarkable to me. Thing is, all this bullying tends to come with a fair amount of paranoid whininess. The weakness shown by people who want to assert themselves as really strong. When he hits a wall of someone he can't push around, he wounds up just pouting. Like a great big weenus. When you hear him and Corgan have sex talk, which are great, cool, didn't need that, you get to hear him explain that he sees sex not as a relationship between sex, bodies, or traits that are appealing, but purely as a matter of power and pleasure. And first of all, this dude gets along with Corgan, who sucks, but also second, he sort of just underscores that right there that nothing about you matters, but that power element. Doesn't care how you talk or present yourself, doesn't care about what you do, except for keeping him around, which I guess is something, because keeping him around involves giving up on a lot of cool things. I guess maybe if he murders almost everyone around him, putting up with him is a sign you want him around for that. He's also the only bi character I could find, so great. Thanks, game. Man, I'm kind of shocked that the game managed to introduce a character I find less appealing than an Anomen.
Verily. I am pleased at the progress that this ill-conceived group has made. I had not thought such a thing possible.
Worst Anomen. Unbelievably, Anomen again. Can you believe he gets worse? Inside you, there are two Anomens. See, what I described above is the Anomen you get if you fail to complete Anomen's trial quest properly. What matters is whether you let him take personal vengeance for his sister's death on his daddy's say-so, or if you instead maybe check to see if you're about to kill someone who didn't do the thing he's being accused of. If you don't kill his sister's accused murderer, Anomen becomes a knight, then you find out his sister's real murderers, and then you get to do a proper murder of them over there, because let's face it, that's the only way to satisfyingly end the story where his family's property was taken from it. Thing is, once he's joined the Radiant Order, he will become more insufferable and self-righteous. He's already a pompous dickhead, but now he's offering the most blindingly obvious, narrow-minded, good counsel, meaning that he's the voice of the second ed D&D's vision of what lawful good is like, which is kinda pro-genocide, anti-rudeness. Like, if you don't like the idea of being webcomic mum, following along the impetuous idiot who thinks of himself as the best boy ever, cleaning up his whoopsies and suggesting that maybe he shouldn't murder someone for personal, petty reasons, you're not going to enjoy his romance. The writers are aware that you can dunk on him a little, but if you make him feel stupid, he stalks off in a huff, and he will have random outbursts not just at you, but at other members of the party. And look, I'm not a person who thinks that a dude grappling with his temper and his sense of superiority should not deserve love. Anomen is probably very close to the me that my partner met, just that I was a lot more scared. But seeing how utterly awful Anomen was to hang around, and seeing how he blows up at random people showed who he really was, and how the apologetic version of him worked, kind of convinced me that there were better ways to be. All of this is bound up in the fact that Anomen's story is about whether he can maintain a relationship with you, and how he responds to the death of his sister. Don't worry, we never get to know anything about her, really. You get to bring the opinions the game lets you to the table, and you never really get to blow him up and see him grow from the things you say. Anomen is a misogynist, because he's the kind of guy who thinks he can't be a misogynist if he just calls women my lady. And this is what happens when you take him down the good path. Conclusion. These games are old. The enhanced edition of this game is 10 years old. We have watched the world change around these characters, and what's seen as good storytelling, what's engaging in a romantic story. Is it fair to judge a year 2000 game by 2023 standards? Yes! Because the standards haven't moved that far. Lesbians existed in 2003. Anomen's behavior creeped out women then, and I know, I was there, I heard them say it. 10 years ago, there were people ranting about Nera being a Tumblrina. I found Redditor commenters only 2 years ago angry that Hexat was gay, though none so excitingly as in the quote I found. We have gotten better at this, but all these characters are still being made with the same fundamental principles of communication through play as we have had for basically ever. And there's still value to be learned from looking back at them and asking ourselves, hey, what the hell? Just like, what the hell?